It's worse than meaningless. It's worse than a mere distraction. It undercuts any serious kind of approach to get to the real issues that are real, legitimate, and can be addressed to end the war.
So Jeffrey Sachs just told Andrew Napolitano how the war in Ukraine could end today, what it would take Trump to do that, and whether he thinks Trump is on the right track to that, and what are the roadblocks that still remain in the way of peace with Russia. And just spoiler, it's actually a little bit more simpler than you might think. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Is this any way to solve a war, or is this just the continuation of our co-belligerent status in the war proxy against Russia?
Of course, it is profoundly inconsistent with what happened at the Alaska meeting.
Right.
At the Alaska meeting, the correct idea was that the war should be ended by getting to the root causes of the war, and that is that Ukraine should be neutral, that NATO would not enlarge, all completely appropriate from a U.S. security point of view, as well as necessary for the Russian point of view, because it's their neighborhood, it's their next door neighbor. They don't want the United States missiles there. That's the point they've been making for 30 years.
And by the way, the U.S. wouldn't tolerate missiles sent into Mexico from Russia on our border, too. I think that's a reasonable ask.
And on that basis, security arrangements should be made through the UN Security Council, which is the place to do this. If we had the minimal capacity of government right now, the minimal professionalism, then based on that meeting, there would be serious work to develop the protocols, the security agreements to end the war. Trump always thinks in a very primitive way, well, I need the baseball bat behind me because I can smash their head and I need to threaten that. You actually don't reach solutions that way.
Yeah, he's exactly right. Maybe that worked in the New York City real estate world. It probably did. It made him a rich man. Read The Art of the Deal, in which he talks about that and how he used bellicosity to drive his opponent to the table with a better deal. But that's not happening with Russia. That method has been an abject failure, and we saw that with the threats of additional sanctions and tariffs toward Russia. He discarded that for a few days to go to this meeting with Putin, no longer talking about that, then poisoning the well with a security guarantee that Russia was never going to accept. Just create a new security arrangement that's indistinguishable from NATO Article 5 and expect that Russia's going to allow for that. And now he's back to threats of sanctions and secondary tariffs again. He just slapped a 50% tariff on India, which is really a tariff on American consumers that would pay more for that. And it's not going to change the situation on the battlefield at all. So Sachs is right. For him to address how to end this war, you have to get back to the basics. No Ukraine and NATO. Stop militarizing. Stop expanding NATO. Stop allowing for the Nazification of Ukraine through the regiment of Azov integrated into the military, withdraw NATO resources, recognize Crimea as Russian, recognize the Donbass as Russian. That's not going back. Zelensky had his chance in 2022 in Istanbul if he wanted to, salvage that territory by granting it autonomy, and he had that opportunity under Minsk. He didn't take it.
You lose the possibility of solutions. Trump's idea of deal making is, yes, we can offer something, but I need to let them know that I can gun them down. And that idea is stopping diplomacy everywhere.
Yeah, got to agree with that. It's not working well at all. Those threats have proven to be idle and non-effectual in affecting, again, the battlefield conditions, of which Russia controls 20% of the Ukraine and probably 85-90% of the Donbass. It hasn't changed regardless of how many threats, what language Trump uses, and what kind of tariffs he slaps on secondary countries that dare trade with Russia.
The United States does not have the capacity to follow through on those threats other than through dramatic escalation of conflict. And other countries say, we're not going to succumb to that crude approach. And so you have the war in the Middle East raging, in which the U.S. is complicit in an ongoing genocide. You have the war in Ukraine, not stopped in 24 hours, but it could have been had there been competence in this. You have the rising tensions and now break in relations with India, because threats don't work the way that Trump thinks they do, or maybe they did if he was negotiating with the plumbers union in New York City on a building. But they don't work in international affairs, and they don't work with other great powers.
Yes, certainly true. Also, the bombings ramped up in Somalia this year. That's a story you never hear about. 55 new bombings of Somalia. The U.S. is still involved in Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen. As part of that war, the U.S. has a starvation blockade that's been there over a decade, started under Obama. You know, Trump used one of his sole vetoes to keep that going. So it's not just in Ukraine and the unlimited support to Israel for its genocide in Gaza that's taking place. This is a worldwide empire building scheme, and that happens regardless of who you elect, whether it was Trump or whether it was Harris or whether it was Biden, a president controlled completely by the deep state. That is what happens. That's the Washington foreign policy establishment. That's the uniparty. The deep state remains the same regardless of the names.
Russia is a great power. China is a great power. India is a great power. Whether we say so or not doesn't change that fact. And to deal with those countries requires responsible diplomacy, not threats of this sort. And this is where we're failing in every single case right now. By the way, I need to be clear. Biden was a disaster. As we talked about many times, the Biden administration failed also. I'm not partisan on this. I'm just saying that we have a track record of massive failure that is continuing.
Right, that's bipartisan. He's exactly right about that. And I'm so glad that minds like Jeffrey Sachs are totally freed from tribalistic partialities. And if anything, Republicans should know above and beyond most people that negotiating with hostile powers is a good thing. What did Ronald Reagan call the Soviet Union? He called it the evil empire. But he was willing to sit down and negotiate with Gorbachev, and it led to a freer, much more prosperous world that happened. You know, give him the credit, give Gorbachev the credit, give Thatcher the credit. I don't care, but that was the right route. It's still the right route, by the way.
Here's his latest threat yesterday at a cabinet meeting. It's exactly what you just, I don't know if you've seen this yet. It's exactly what you described, Professor Sachs. Chris, cut number 2.
I want to see that deal end. It's very, very serious what I have in mind if I have to do it, but I want to see it end. I think that in many ways he's there. Sometimes he'll be there and Zelensky won't be there. You know, it's like, who do we have today? I got to get them both at the same time. But I want to have it end. We have economic sanctions. I'm talking about economic, because we're not going to get into a world war. I'll tell you what, in my opinion, if I didn't win this race, Ukraine could have ended up in a world war. We're not going to end up in a world war. And
it's a world proxy war at this point. It's NATO versus the BRICS countries. Guess who's funding Russia and trading with Russia during this? The BRICS countries. Guess who's funding Ukraine and aiding Ukraine during this? The West and NATO. Treating Ukraine as a de facto NATO power, even if they won't say it because of what stipulations that would bring. That's the truth. And this could still spiral out of control, especially because this is two nuclear powers clashing with each other. We don't want to get to that point. We need detente. We don't need antagonism.
it will not be a world war, but it will be an economic war. And an economic war is going to be bad. And it's going to be bad for Russia. And I don't want that.
Hasn't been that bad for Russia. Actually, Russian economic capabilities have gradually risen since they invaded, but I don't think that has anything to do with them fighting a war. It's because more powers have been willing to trade with them as a result of them in some way standing up to the United States. That's why the BRICS alliance is galvanizing together. That's why India is being driven closer to the BRICS alliance. And the threat of them creating a new currency that becomes the world reserve currency is a serious thing to consider, especially as the dollar right now is generally the world reserve currency. If it were not so, that would be economically catastrophic for the US, but everything the US does in terms of foreign policy is making that scenario more and more likely.
You have any idea what he's talking about?
No, it's not possible. And honestly, maybe probably he doesn't understand. Probably no one around him understands. You need actually to do homework. I'm sorry to say it. Professor, I give homework. You actually need to do homework. You need to have documents. You need to exchange them. You need to discuss specific topics. You need to discuss the role of the UN Security Council. You need to move to solutions. These threats that go on and go off and go on and go off are worse than useless. They're not merely distractions. They absolutely undercut reaching agreements. And I understand I've never negotiated a casino. I've never negotiated a building in New York City. Maybe it's done in a different way. But I have been involved for 40 years in intergovernmental agreements. And you don't do it this way when you're talking with other great powers.
Yeah, I'll take Sachs over Trump any day when it comes to negotiations and diplomacy in the foreign policy arena. Whether or not you consider casino deals and plumbing deals and real estate deals, that's a whole matter separately. Yeah, you can use the same tactics, but will they work on the international arena? I don't think so. If I was president, Jeffrey Sachs would be my Secretary of State. I trust him any day over this Trump madness. And again, it's not any different than the Biden madness outside of being willing to talk to Putin. That's the only difference so far.
It has to be more serious than this. It's not improv land. This is also why the idea that was pressed by the U.S. and pressed by Zelensky, who also has the least capacity and experience in this of everybody. We need a three-way meeting. We need a three-way meeting. No, you need concepts of how this is going to end. You need documents that are exchanged. You need to discuss clauses of those documents where you disagree. Everyone can go online, look at the New York Times because they posted them, the Russia-Ukraine communique of the end of March 2022, the draft agreement, April 15th, 2022, between Russia and Ukraine that ended the war if the United States had let it happen.
Yeah, this is called the Istanbul Accords. Some accounts had Zelensky agreeing to this peace deal with Russia in the first weeks of this war, only to be talked out of it by Boris Johnson, we know that from the UK, and presumably the US government, the State Department, the Jake Sullivans and Anthony Blinkens and Joe Bidens of the world. But, there's no way Joe Biden was talking him out of that. It was his deep state subordinates. But that's the case. And under those terms, it would have been far better. And this was before 1 million or more deaths on the Ukrainian side. Zelensky could have, salvaged the Donbass, just granted them independence that was called for in the Minsk Accords. That's what Putin wanted, just the Minsk Accords to be enforced, to give that region, autonomy like Hong Kong had for so long. That's what they wanted. But, neutrality is never tolerated by the deep state in the U.S. This was a war. They wanted war. They wanted blood.
Instead, the U.S. intervened, broke the process, and there has not been that kind of systematic diplomacy since then. Maybe the U.S. is incapable of doing homework assignments anymore. But what we just observed in Donald Trump's statements has nothing to do with ending the war in Ukraine. It's worse than meaningless. It's worse than a mere distraction. It undercuts any serious kind of approach to get to the real issues that are real, legitimate, and can be addressed to end the war.
Yeah, exactly right. That's entirely true. None of this threats of sanctions and secondary tariffs have paid any dividends or changed the situation on the battlefield in any regard. No matter how much money that the U.S. has poured into Ukraine, which is about $200 billion right now, might be more in the future, I don't know, that hasn't disrupted their occupation of the Donbass, which they have to the tune of something like 90% of it. I think it's only part of Luhansk that they don't have. They have most of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and they have Crimea. And if you're saying that Crimea is still part of Ukraine in 2025, you've been gaslit into thinking pigs can fly. That's how utopian this prospect is at this point. You're never going to get a better deal. So slapping secondary sanctions on India, the very country that would benefit the U.S. from establishing closer relations with, is a terrible idea. The way that you can shatter the power that BRICS has is to pull India away from that alliance, not to antagonize it into being closerly bonded to that alliance. And that's exactly what Trump's done. So yes, Sachs is right. If you got down to the basics of the basic Russian asks, which is don't militarize our border, don't put our adjacent country into your military alliance, because guess what? The U.S. won't accept them doing that with Canada after they couped the government of Canada and installed their own regime, their own provisional government that was antagonistic toward the United States, then put dual-purpose ballistic missile systems, that's what the U.S. did in Ukraine, the Aegis missile systems, pointed toward the United States. They would not accept that, just as Russia doesn't want to accept that on its own border. We know that the U.S. didn't accept that when the Soviets sent missiles into Cuba to do that at the same time that the U.S. was setting up missiles in Turkey pointed toward the Soviet Union. It's a basic ask. It's not unreasonable to ask that they are neutral. They're not part of NATO. And the U.S. should just disband from NATO, defund NATO completely. Trump actually raised that in his first campaign on the campaign trail. The fact that NATO was truthfully, and I think he rightly was correct in this, a remnant of the Cold War that had no real function today other than exacerbating a dangerous entangling alliance. Well, that's exactly what we have today. And Trump is doubling down on expanding that, escalating the wars that it's involved in, and doing nothing to bring peace to this theater. So if you really want peace in Ukraine, Sachs is right. You have to make a declaration that Ukraine won't be part of NATO. You have to stop funding Ukraine and being a belligerent in the Russian mind and how they're looking at this. U.S. is on one side. For all that they painted Trump as a Russian asset, he sure is giving Zelensky a hell of a lot of money. You have to demilitarize. You have to take NATO resources out, take U.S. resources out of Eastern Europe, and denazify Ukraine. Stop the influence that literal Nazis have in that government, including in their military. And people will say this is a pipe dream, but it's not. Read about Andriy Beletsky. If you disagree with me on that, you can find lots of information on that. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below, is Jeffrey Sachs right? Can Trump end the war if he was willing to take the steps necessary? Is it deliberate on his part to extend and prolong this war? And what do you think the ramifications are going to be? Is Russia going to just take more territory now? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Judge Napolitano. I appreciate this interview. And if you're watching this, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. That will allow you to help support the channel, and I will graciously appreciate you if you go to that links to help. And in return, I'll give you access to all my members only videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.